welcome back to the next installment of FRM 110, Principles of Fermentation. During this session, we're going to talk briefly on yeast management, specifically pitching, your health, the viability, and we'll touch briefly on contaminations and mutations. First and foremost, sanitize, sanitize, sanitize. We'll take a look in here. This is a yeast sample that was pulled. You have bacteria growing right in here, bacteria and mold. You can see bacteria forming on these kegs here, and it's so thick, it's actually growing, and you can see the texture on the rim of the keg right there. Keep it clean. Always keep it clean. That should be the priority in your mind of anything you brew. So let's talk some terms. The first term we're going to talk about is pitching yeast. Simply put, that is just the amount of yeast that you're pitching into your sweet wort to achieve your fermentation. We'll talk a little bit about viability. Viability is the quantity of live cells in a particular sample, or in your yeast sample that you're going to pitch into your wort. So viability is the quantity of living cells. There's a term that I don't have a slide for, it's vitality, and that is actually the ability of your yeast cells to reproduce and to ferment your beer out. So there's a difference. Viability, vitality. Viability is simply the number of living cells. Vitality is the ability to ferment. Now we'll talk about pitching rate. Pitching rate is nothing more than the amount of yeast you need to put into your wort to efficiently get your fermentation to the desired outcome. Unless you're counting each individual cell, and there's billions of them, trillions of them. Counting each cell, you're either going to overpitch or underpitch. Overpitching is when you add too much yeast cells. That's going to affect your yeast health over time. It could create some mutations, and it'll create an unhealthy yeast and its viability later on down the road. And if you underpitch, you're simply not adding enough yeast to your ferment. This is mostly going to affect flavors, including all flavors for beers that you don't necessarily want. Okay, so pitching. Here's the starting point. Start with 1 million yeast cells per milliliter of wort per degree of PlayDoh. You'll see some breweries have their yeast program really dialed in. For ales, they'll use 750,000 yeast cells, and for lagers, because it's colder, because it needs more yeast, they'll start with 1.5 million yeast cells. But as a playing factor, and to kind of teach you this, we'll keep it simple with 1 million yeast cells per milliliter of wort per degree of PlayDoh. And each brewery is going to have their own pitching rates and processes. So what I'm teaching here, you walk into another brewery, they may do it slightly different. They've got different yeast, they've got different quantities, they're trying to achieve different things. So every brewery is going to have their own pitching rate. But again, we'll just keep it simple and we'll walk through this. So we talked about PlayDoh. So PlayDoh is one of 3 ways that commonly measures the sugars inside your wort. So we do this with a refractometer. Kate's going to talk about it. She'll kind of show you a little bit more of what we got here in the brewery. But this is a refractometer, and you can see this is a scale that you'll see when you're looking in through, and it'll tell you what your Brix or your specific gravity is. And then there's PlayDoh out there as well. It just depends on which refractometer you get. And again, it's just measuring the gravity. How much sugar is actually in your wort? 3 commonly used measurements: Brix, PlayDoh, and specific gravity. I personally would argue specific gravity and PlayDoh, the 2 most common. Here at Hopkinsville Brewing Company, we use specific gravity. But as you showed in the other slide, the formula accounts for PlayDoh. So how do we get that? Okay, let's start backwards. So we have our PlayDoh. Say we have a PlayDoh of 10. We can take our scientific calculator here, and we can sit here and we can say, okay, 1 plus open parentheses, a PlayDoh of 10 divided by open parentheses 258.6 minus open parentheses, PlayDoh of 10 divided by 258.2 close parentheses. Multiply that by 227.1 close parentheses, close parentheses, close parentheses. And you'll see that is what you're going to come up with, which is on the board here. If you have a simpler method and a whole lot easier, you simply take 259, reduce that by your PlayDoh, and you divide that by 259. So if you do the formula out here, you can see I did it by steps here. You're going to come up with the same exact specific gravity here. Obviously this is more accurate. This is really dialed in. And if you really just need a ballpark figure, you can take PlayDoh divided by 4, and that's going to give you your 40, or what we say in specific gravity is 1040. And it's the other way around when you have your specific gravity and you need to get your PlayDoh. Again, you can sit here with your calculator, you can dial all that in, take you 5 minutes to do it, or you simply take your specific gravity, reduce by 1, which is going to give you 0.40, multiply by 250, and that's going to give you a PlayDoh of 10. Really simple. Okay, so let's talk about, we talked about PlayDoh, we talked about millions of yeast cells, and let's run through an example here. So let's say you're at a brewery, again, that requires 1 million yeast cells per milliliter. We have 85 gallons of blonde ale, like we commonly do here at HBC, and we have a specific gravity of 1040. So how many yeast cells do we need? Okay, we use 1 million yeast cells per milliliter or per degree of PlayDoh. Let's do the math. So you take 85 gallons, and you're going to multiply that by 3.7854. That's going to give you the number of liters you have. You multiply that by 1,000, that's going to tell you how many milliliters you have. So 85 gallons of beer is 321,759 milliliters. Now we're going to convert our specific gravity to PlayDoh. We do the formula here, we see we have a PlayDoh of 10. So now we're working with 1 million yeast cells per milliliter. We're going to multiply that by the number of milliliters, and we'll multiply that by our PlayDoh. When you do the formula math there, you see we've got 3,217,590,000,000 yeast cells. I know that sounds like a lot, but it's really not. Let's try another formula, just so you can kind of see how this math works out. This time we're working at a brewery that's really got their yeast cells dialed in. They have a 10-barrel batch of pale ale, and they have a specific gravity of 1045, because not every beer is 1040. They're not easy numbers. So how many yeast cells do we need? So we take 750,000 yeast cells per milliliter per degree of PlayDoh. Let's break that down. We have a 10-barrel batch. Multiply that 31. That's going to tell you how many gallons of beer you're going to have. You convert gallons into milliliters. We're going to convert our specific gravity to PlayDoh, which is going to give us 11.25. And we just multiply that all together. And you can see we end up with just under 10 trillion yeast cells. Again, seems like a lot. Okay, so what does that really equate to? You know, we saw on this slide here, we need 10 trillion yeast cells. What does that really, what do we need? What do we got to offer to get that? So the simplest method is dry yeast. Most yeast packages will tell you how many yeast cells per package. So for instance, in Lalaman, they'll tell you that 1 gram of their yeast contains a minimum of 5 billion yeast cells in that package. So if we needed, like we needed our first example, 3 trillion yeast cells, we would need 643 billion grams of dry yeast. Another common method that you'll see is a prepackaged slurry, a wet yeast, if you will. Y yeast is a big contributor of those. And Y yeast will tell you that their package contains 100 billion yeast cells, which is good for a 5-gallon batch or 19 liters. So if we're taking our example again, and we needed 3 trillion yeast cells, we would need 32 of these packets to pitch in our yeast. And finally, you have your in-house harvested yeast. You pull your yeast out, you can throw it in a mason jar, you can throw it in a keg, you can throw it into whatever vessel you're going to do to keep your yeast and harvest it. It's arguably the cheapest because now you don't have to buy a second batch of yeast. However, it's not exactly the simplest method either, because now we've got to figure out exactly how much do we have. That's going to be the challenge with it, is estimating our slurry density. So over time, you'll experience this and you'll see what yeast cells kind of look like. So I did 2 samples here. put them in vials, and this is a roughly 3 billion yeast cells in that vial. 3 billion yeast cells per milliliter in this vial. You can see as the yeast settles out, it's really compact and really thick down on the bottom here. When you shake it all up, you can see it gets real thick. You really can't see through it. So that's about 3 billion yeast cells per milliliter. And I did a really weakened or diluted sample here, about a half a billion, about 500 million yeast cells per milliliter. You can see it's just that little bit down here that's compact. That's your yeast. The rest of this is just wort, water, and suspension. When you shake that all up, you can see that's simply opaque, and you can really just see through it. A very diluted sample here. So we know we're going to have our in-house harvested slurry. Okay. Again, we're going to use that same example of 85 gallons of loam. We know the number of cells needed divided by the estimated cells will tell us how much yeast do we really need. So if we take that 3 trillion yeast cells needed, and we know our sample has 2 billion cells per milliliter, you can see we need 1,608 milliliters of yeast. If we had 3 billion yeast cells per milliliter, we would need just under 1,100 milliliters of yeast. And if you're looking at a mason jar, so a mason jar, so this is going to be about 1,500 milliliters of yeast, of thick, compact. Mason jar is about 3,000 milliliters, I think it is. Don't quote me on that. But the mason jars are graduated. Other ways we can do this, we can actually weigh our yeast out. So if we have dry yeast, we know that dry yeast weighs about 8 grams per 100 billion cells. You weigh it out yourself, get your little scale, put your dry yeast in there, and that's what you'll pitch. If you're using a liquid weight and you're trying to really weigh out, how much is in that mason jar based on weight, you're going to get a lot of room for error because you have to account for the weight of water and how much water is in there. And you also have to be really accurate on your density sample. When you start making errors here and here, all those errors are going to compound and really put your error margin in multiples. Or you can do a tank-to-tank transfer. This by far is the cleanest way and the most sanitary way to do it. It certainly alleviates the exposure of contamination. But with that, you need a calibrated pump to really dial in how much yeast is being pushed through the valves and the ports. But you still need to assess your yeast viability. Just because you're pulling out doesn't mean that's what you're getting. As you get closer to the end of your yeast pool, it's going to be more diluted. So you've got to be able to still assess for that. Factors for pitch and error. Probably the most common is the age of your yeast. Your yeast has been sitting in your cold room for 4 weeks. About 20% of them yeast cells are going to die out. So now you're only working with about an 80% viability yeast. And you lose about 5% every week the longer it sits in there. So you figure, 6 weeks into it, you're only looking at 70% yeast cell. 70% is a big margin. Probably don't want to be using that. Ballpark is 4 weeks. Otherwise, you may not get the results you're looking for. Other pitch and error factors, pitch and error factors, is you got to account for the hop flakes. If you dry hopped an IPA, those hop flakes are going to fall in suspension. They're going to be mixed in with your yeast. So now you're accounting for hop flakes, which is not yeast. Same with cold break, which is your protein, and of course dead yeast cells. There's going to be dead yeast cells mixed in with your yeast sample. And then if you get a poor sample, you have a ale yeast, remember where that yeast sits, and your lager yeast, that sits down at the bottom. If you have poor samples, you've got other particulates in your yeast sample, and you got an old yeast sample sitting out there, it's going to cause a lot of error, and it'll really compound over time. So let's talk about yeast health. Here's all the things that factor your yeast health. Obviously, we just got finished talking about your age, your nutrients, your oxygen, temperature, and contaminants all have a factor in your yeast health. all these factors enter your yeast. Your yeast is going to create your carbon dioxide, your alcohol, and your flavor and aromatic compounds. So the yeast, I'm not going to harp on this too much more. Basically, you lose about 5% viability per week. They age out quick, reuse them quicker, and you'll have a healthy yeast. Nutrients. All these nutrients are going to come from your wort, whether it's coming from the grain that's in the wort or it's coming from the water that's in the wort. All these nutrients, and there's others out there, feed the health of your yeast. Oxygenation. We all need oxygen. I need oxygen, you need oxygen, our yeast needs oxygen, and it's really important to us. But for yeast, it's most important during the growth phase. That oxygen is what gets them yeast going to produce more yeast, to start eating all the sugars that you need. If you delay that yeast growth, that's going to give time for bacteria to sit in your wort that may have been transferred in accidentally and overtake your wort, which is going to give you that off-flavored beer. And when you're working with lagers and high gravity, keep in mind that because it is a lager, you need more oxygen, essentially because you need more yeast. So oxygen is an important factor. Temperature. I know in the wintertime, I like to put a jacket on. I get cold. I don't like to be cold. Yeast are the same way. When they get cold, they're going to go dormant. They're going to fall out of suspension, and they're not going to want to do anything. And therefore, you're not going to get your fermentation that you want. If it's too hot, you'll actually kill your yeast off, and they'll just sit dead in the bottom of your fermenter, and you're not going to get your fermentation. I know we just talked about harvesting yeast and putting it in a cold room or a refrigerator. When you do that, ensure that you pull that yeast out and you allow it to warm up gradually to room temperature. So when you pitch it into your wort, it's not such a shock factor. It's not too cold, it's not too hot. And the yeast will just start doing what they do. They'll eat sugars, they'll consume the oxygen, and they'll give you a good fermentation. And contaminants. Here's your two biggest factors right here. Bacteria, which is normally sitting on your dirty equipment. If you don't clean your equipment, like I said in the very first slide, sanitize, sanitize, sanitize. If you have that dirty equipment, you're going to end up with bacteria, and you'll know when your yeast has been contaminated, you're going to get off flavors. So that's the first part of this presentation. I'm going to move to a location where I can actually talk about the next part, because we're going to start talking about a microscope and actually counting yeast cells, and we'll pick it up from